Welcome to Rappahannock Issues. I'm Tom Cohen.
And I'm David Kerr.
And we're going to be looking at topics that are of interest to our community, both regionally and to the state. Welcome to Rappahannock Issues. I'm Tom Cohen. An important anniversary is coming up. That's the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II. And to commemorate that and honor those who served, we are here at the Globe in Laurel, an icon in our area, to talk to Rick Spooner, who is an icon, and as well as another icon, Laura Lacey. Laura Lacey is an author who has written 2 books, Stay Off the Skyline, and as well as Ortiz, To Live a Man's Life. She is the 6th Marine Division historian. So, Laura, and she's also a personal family friend, and welcome to be on the show.
It's good to be here.
We start off with what makes, with the 70th anniversary coming forward, what made World War II in the Pacific different from that in Europe?
Well, first off, I think it's important that we understand that the 70th is especially important because in just a few years there are going to be no more of these guys around. And so it's important that we commemorate it and understand and pass the legacy on. And how is the war different in Europe? The war in Europe was primarily a war between very like people. And the Germans or the Italians understood the concept, we live to fight another day. We fight with a set of rules that were kind of those Judeo-Christian military rules, the Napoleonic type rules. And that will not be the case. There will be no rules in the Pacific theater. And so it becomes an incredibly brutal war. And it was a war that you were fighting an enemy who didn't value life like you did. Dick Bush, Medal of Honor recipient, said, you know, it's hard to fight an enemy who wants to die when you want to live. And I think that is so much encapsulates that whole concept that for the Japanese, war meant killing and there was not going to be any quarter given. And so the Marines and the Army and the Navy personnel who served in the Pacific learned equally to be brutal and to fight with that idea that they had to fight at all costs.
And the young men and women who go over to the Pacific Theater are awfully young. I mean, and they're right off the farms. It means a totally different mindset to a lot of people when we have a trained military. I mean, there was different mindset in World War II.
Absolutely. One of my favorite guys in my first book was a guy named Paulie Demise. And Paulie was from New York. He had been running numbers and got caught. And the judge says you can go to a state institution or a federal institution, whichever you want. And in the back of the room, of course, sitting there were all of these wonderful recruiters. And he became a Marine. He came back to the States after having served for 42 months at the age of 19.
Wow.
2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star, etc., so forth.
What assets did the United States have in going into the Pacific?
there was always this concept of Europe first in the World War II, that we were going to concentrate most of our assets in Europe and start a process of island hopping back towards Japan. So there were 22 divisions of Army personnel, there were 6 divisions for the Marine Corps, and then countless naval personnel. For example, at Okinawa, it was the largest armada in the history of the U.S. Navy.
With going into the island hopping, and I know you've gone through some of the tunnels that are that the Japanese use as defensive. Can you describe that?
Sure. My World War II veterans were always amazed when they found out that I had been in those caves, and I tried to remind them that they had to keep in mind they weren't shooting at me when I was in those caves. Did run into a few habus, which is their rattlesnake, but it was not as dangerous as it sounds. However, it could get pretty interesting because the military had practiced something called a corkscrew and blowtorch. And that would be where they would throw a satchel charge into the caves and then use a flamethrower. And then they might go in and try to get the Japanese out or whatever. So many of the caves that we explored on Okinawa, the ceiling had actually fallen in. So you'd have to remove that debris first, and then you could start digging for artifacts, etc., and so forth. Some of the caves I went into were 3 and 4 stories high, which is something for us to even imagine is very, very different. Okinawa was limestone and coral, so that's how that worked.
And then the sense of defenses, these types of defenses that they use, were really very lethal for our men.
Because they could pop up behind you. You never knew where they were, plus they could get so entrenched and dug in. It was very difficult fighting. And even our softening up efforts, if they're underground, you can soften up all you want, but they're still going to be there when you get to the island.
Right, and then it goes back to what we were saying, where Europe really didn't have that type.
Absolutely.
That was more of the traditional fighting, whereas this is just harsher. What impacts did this have on the men who were fighting in that theater?
I think that, like I said, there was a level of brutality that was different. They were also finding a different enemy. They weren't looking at somebody who might have been their cousin or a neighbor back in the other world. Also, the conditions of just climate and stuff were very, very different. So that it was a different war, no matter how you look at it.
And what success stories can you share about, since you've dealt with so many of the men?
Oh, the men who I have been blessed to get to spend a lot of time with came back and lived the lives that they felt they had to do for the guys who never came home. The World War II generation has volunteered more than any other generation in history. They came home and became solid, good citizens, and that generation will be missed immensely.
I know one of my grandfathers was in the Navy and rode a ship back into Pearl and then was there at Midway and saw the kamikazes. And it sort of is an impact, that type of fighting and all. I mean, it's not something that he was ready to talk about easily.
No, and that is one of the things I found that I knew in some ways more than many of the wives did about their husbands as I started doing this research, because these guys came on and got on with life. And they didn't particularly want to talk about it. However, after the 50th anniversary, especially with the Enola Gay, with them not being willing to show the Enola Gay at the Smithsonian, many of these World War II veterans realized if they didn't start talking about it, there would be a revisionist history written. And they were very, very concerned about that revisionist history. And so many of them, I hit them at the perfect time, right after the 50th, where they could start. They decided they needed to tell what had really happened in the Pacific. The American government policy to kind of soften Japan was very important for our relationships with them afterwards.
And after this break, what we will do is we will have Major Spooner with us, who is an icon and is a remarkable man, and we hope you come back to join us.